You don't belong here. People like you scare customers. Officer Daniel Holt's voice cut through the quiet morning at Daisy's Diner like a blade. Every head turned. Forks stopped mid-air. Coffee cups froze above saucers. In that single moment, the entire diner fell silent, as if someone had drained the air from the room. The words hung there, sharp, heavy, and humiliating. James Whitaker, a 59-year-old black Navy veteran, sat in his usual booth by the window, his oatmeal half finished, his worn Navy cap resting on the table beside him. He didn't move, he didn't flinch, but everyone else could feel the tension tighten like a noose. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss powerful stories like this. And hit like if you believe our veterans deserve dignity and respect. James wasn't just another man passing through Augusta, Maine, to the regulars at Daisy's Diner. He was family every Wednesday, rain or shine. He walked 3 miles from the shelter down on Water Street to this small brick diner. He always ordered the same thing: oatmeal with raisins, black coffee, and, if it was fresh, a slice of apple pie. He always tipped exactly 22%, no matter how little he had. It wasn't about money, it was about honor. $1 for every year he survived since the day he pulled 6 sailors out of a burning deck during a missile strike back in 1991. James never told anyone that story. Most people didn't know. But Holt didn't care about stories. He saw only what he wanted to see: a black man in a worn gray hoodie, shoes patched with duct tape, sitting alone in a corner booth. You. Holt barked again, pointing his finger like an accusation. Do you even belong here? James slowly raised his eyes, calm, steady, deliberate. I'm eating, he said softly. Paid for it. Holt's partner, Officer Tara Vance, a younger, sharp-eyed woman clutching a clipboard, stepped closer and chimed in. Got a receipt? Before James could answer, Lila, the 42-year-old waitress who had served him for years, turned from behind the counter, her smoky voice cutting in. He's a regular. Every Wednesday. Paid in cash. Like always. Holt's cold gaze snapped toward her. Did I ask you? Ma'am? Lila froze but didn't back down. She placed a mug of fresh coffee on James's table, sliding it gently toward him, her hand trembling slightly. James picked it up, sipped slowly, and set it back down. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of steel. Lila's got my order. Check the register if you need proof. Holt stepped closer, towering over the booth, his shadow falling across the table. ID. Now. James reached into the pocket of his faded hoodie and pulled out a worn VA card. The edges were bent, the laminate peeling. He handed it over without a word. Holt glanced at it, scoffed, and handed it back. No driver's license? Figures. What are you? Homeless? His voice was loud enough for the entire diner to hear. The insult landed like a slap. A couple sitting at the counter shifted uncomfortably. A delivery driver by the door stared down at his shoes. James took the card, placed it carefully back into his pocket, and looked Holt dead in the eye. No house, he said evenly. But I got a home, right here in Augusta. The room went completely still. Tara Vance hesitated, glancing at James's name on her clipboard, whispering almost to herself. Silver Star, Navy, 1991. But Holt ignored her. He leaned in, his jaw tight, his voice dropping lower but somehow sharper, like a knife dragged across glass. You're taking up space. Pal, folks don't want you here. Makes them nervous. That's when Lila snapped. She slammed her tray down on the counter, the sound echoing through the diner. Nervous? He's been here longer than you've had a badge. Holt turned on her instantly, his face flushed red, finger jabbing toward her chest. Stay out of this, ma'am. But Marcus, the 55-year-old diner owner, stepped out from behind the counter, drying his hands on a rag as he walked up. Officers, he said firmly, standing between James and Holt. You got a real reason to be here, or are you just looking for trouble? Holt straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim control. We got a call about a suspicious person. He lied without hesitation. Marcus frowned. Who called? Holt didn't answer. His silence said everything. James's fingers tapped gently against the table. Once, twice, 3 times. An old nervous habit from his Navy days when waiting for orders that never came easy. He had been here before. Not this diner, but this feeling. The stares. The suspicion. The slow tightening of a room until breathing felt like a luxury. He had learned to keep his voice low, his movements slow, to de-escalate before others chose escalation for him. But today felt different. He'd been carrying this weight for years, and it was getting heavier. He spoke softly, the words deliberate but full of quiet exhaustion. I haven't broken any laws. So why you talking to me like I did? Holt smirked. Leaning in so close, James could see the small scar under his chin. Because you're in my town, pal, and I decide what's out of place. Something inside James shifted. He'd been dismissed, ignored, underestimated before. But this was different. This wasn't about him being invisible. This was about being made small on purpose. He closed his eyes for half a second, inhaled deeply, then reached into his hoodie pocket. Holt's hand twitched, fingers brushing the edge of his holster. What's that? James slowly pulled out an old, scratched Nokia flip phone. The hinge squeaked as he opened it. He pressed a number, one he had memorized years ago, and held it to his ear. The entire diner went silent again. 2 rings, then a click. Sarah, he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. It's happening again. Holt's jaw clenched. Who the hell did you just call? James closed the phone, set it down on the table next to his worn cap, and answered without looking up. Someone who'll listen. Holt's jaw tightened as the silence in Daisy's diner deepened, the tension thick enough to choke on, and every eye in the room stayed locked on the quiet man in the corner booth, the one who had just made a single phone call that none of them yet understood. James Whitaker sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his coffee mug, his calmness unnerving Holt even more. While Officer Tara Vance shifted uncomfortably beside him, her pen tapping the clipboard as if she wanted to disappear into the linoleum floor. And Holt finally barked. Louder this time, his voice sharp enough to pierce glass. Who the hell did you just call? But James didn't answer right away, letting the silence hang until he finally lifted his gaze and said in that steady, measured tone that seemed to infuriate Holt even more. Someone who outranks you. The room buzzed softly with nervous whispers. And Lila, standing behind the counter with her hand clutching a coffee pot, leaned toward Marcus and whispered. He called her, didn't he? And Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening because he knew exactly who James meant, though Holt didn't. Not yet. Holt slammed his palm against the counter, making a spoon rattle in its saucer, and growled. Don't play games with me, old man. You think calling some friend is going to save you? Not today. James stayed silent, and the stillness around him only made Holt's anger boil hotter. But then Tara Vance glanced down at her tablet, her voice soft, almost hesitant as she murmured. Sergeant, his records here, 20 years Navy, Silver Star, Gulf War veteran, saved 6 men during a missile strike. Her words trailed off when she saw Holt's face twist with irritation. But before she could say more, Holt snapped. I don't care if he saved the damn president. Tara, he doesn't belong here making my job harder. And that was when Marcus stepped forward from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel, his voice steady but laced with steel. Your job? Your job is to serve and protect, not harass paying customers in my diner, and if you can't tell the difference, Maybe you're in the wrong line of work. Holt spun toward him, his bulk towering over Marcus. But Marcus didn't move, his shoulders squared, while Lila finally spoke up, her voice trembling but defiant. You're embarrassing yourself. Daniel, everyone here knows James. He's family to us. Holt sneered, his eyes narrowing. Family? You calling this drifter family? And James finally leaned forward, placing his cracked Nokia phone gently on the table as he spoke in a low, even tone that carried across the room. I wore this country's uniform for 20 years. I've bled for it. I've buried brothers for it. And right now, the only person embarrassing themselves is you. Holt froze for half a second, caught off guard by James's composure, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. His voice rose, loud and cutting. You think that uniform means something to me? Out here. I make the rules, not you. And that was when the small bell above the diner door jingled violently as it swung open, letting in a gust of damp air and the sound of rain pounding against the pavement. And a woman's sharp, commanding voice filled the room before anyone even saw her face. Not today. Sergeant Holt. Not in my jurisdiction. Every head turned toward the door where Sarah Coleman stood, her dark blazer damp from the rain, her badge held high in one hand, her piercing eyes locked straight on Holt. And the authority in her voice made even the air feel heavier. Deputy Director of the Department of Justice, Sarah Coleman, James's old Navy friend, had arrived faster than anyone expected, and her very presence shifted the balance of power in the room instantly. Holt blinked, his anger faltering just long enough for confusion to set in. Deputy Director, he muttered, as if saying the words out loud might somehow make this less real. But Sarah strode forward without hesitation, her heels striking the linoleum like a countdown, and she stopped barely a foot from him, holding her badge inches from his chest, her voice low and deliberate. Badge number. Now. Holt hesitated, his throat working as he swallowed, his pride warring with the instinct to obey. But Sarah didn't flinch, didn't soften, and repeated, firmer this time. Badge number. Sergeant. Or I'll pull it myself. Tara Vance shifted awkwardly beside him, already reaching for her radio with trembling fingers. But Holt finally muttered his number under his breath, and Sarah nodded once, never breaking eye contact. Good. Now you're going to step back and explain exactly why you're harassing a decorated veteran in a public diner without probable cause. Holt stammered. We got a complaint about a suspicious person. But Sarah's expression didn't change as she leaned in, her voice like ice. No, you didn't. We monitor all active calls. There was no complaint. You walked in here, saw a black man sitting quietly with his breakfast, and decided to make him your problem. That stops now. The words dropped heavy, like hammers on stone, and the diner erupted into murmurs, customers whispering, phones coming out to record, someone at the counter muttering, "She's DOJ," while Lila exhaled audibly in relief, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. And Marcus crossed his arms, nodding slowly as if the scales had finally tipped. Holt's ears burned red as he glanced around the room and realized half a dozen phones were pointed at him, recording every move, but his ego refused to surrender. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he started, and Sarah cut him off instantly, her tone slicing through his words like glass. "Respect? You forfeited respect the moment you laid your hands on your belt like he was a threat. Don't test me. Sergeant, your body cam is live, your radio's open, and trust me, I'm listening to every word." Vance, still silent until now, finally spoke up, her voice soft but audible. "Deputy Director, maybe we should step outside and sort this out." And Sarah nodded slightly, her tone measured but firm. "That's exactly what's going to happen. Both of you. Outside. Now." Holt hesitated, looking like a man balancing on the edge of a cliff. But Tara tugged his arm gently and whispered something none of the customers could hear. And finally, reluctantly, Holt turned and pushed through the door, the bell above it jangling violently as it slammed shut behind him, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of Daisy's diner like the eye of a storm. The air in the room felt lighter instantly, but the weight of what just happened lingered in every corner. Lila set down the coffee pot she'd been holding so tightly, her hand had gone numb, whispering, "God bless that woman," while Marcus finally exhaled, muttering under his breath, "About damn time." Sarah turned to James, her voice softening, losing the sharp edges it had carried moments before. "You okay?" James nodded slowly, his fingers still resting on the table, though his knuckles were pale. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "Just tired." Sarah, tired of proving I belong, she pulled out the seat across from him and sat down, her expression full of understanding, her voice gentler now. "I know. But this time, we're not letting it slide." James didn't answer right away, just stared down into his black coffee, the steam curling upward like ghosts of memories he never asked to relive. And after a long pause, he whispered, almost to himself, "Feels like it's never gonna end." And Sarah placed her hand gently over his, her voice steady. "Then we'll make it end." Outside the diner, through the rain-speckled windows, Holt could be seen pacing beside his cruiser, his fists clenched, his radio crackling softly with background chatter, unaware that his body cam had captured every single second of his humiliation, every cruel word, every aggressive move, and that video was already being routed through DOJ servers for review. He didn't know it yet, but the storm he started was only beginning, and by nightfall, the entire country would know James Whitaker's name. The rain outside Daisy's diner came down harder now, splashing against the windows as Sarah Coleman pushed open the door, her heels clicking sharply on the wet pavement, her badge still in hand as she strode toward the two officers waiting by the cruiser. And inside the diner, every customer pressed closer to the windows, some holding up phones, their cameras ready, because they could sense something big was about to happen. Daniel Holt stood stiffly, his jaw locked, pacing like a caged animal, his hand hovering near his belt as if gripping control he didn't have, while Tara Vance stood a few feet back, her posture tight and nervous, avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. And Sarah didn't slow her pace, stopping just inches from Holt, her voice low but steady, sharp enough to cut through the rain. "Sergeant Holt, this ends now." But Holt shook his head, his voice raised, trying to reclaim authority. "With all due respect, ma'am, you don't walk into my town and tell me how to do my job." And Sarah tilted her head slightly, the rain sliding off her blazer, her tone calm but colder than ice. "Your job is to serve and protect, not humiliate veterans eating their breakfast. This isn't your town. Sergeant, this is my jurisdiction right now, and unless you'd like to explain your actions to the U.S. Attorney in the next 10 minutes, you're going to stand down." Holt's nostrils flared, his voice rough, almost shouting now. "He's a drifter, deputy director. Men like him stir trouble. I don't need a DOJ lecture on how to keep Augusta safe." And Sarah stepped even closer until there was barely an inch of space between them, her words deliberate, every syllable cutting through the rain. "You want to talk about trouble? Let's talk about your body cam. Sergeant, it recorded every word you said, every step you took, every time your hand rested on that holster, and it's already transmitting live to the DOJ servers. So tell me again, right now, how exactly you plan to explain to Washington why a decorated Navy veteran, a Silver Star recipient, was harassed in a public diner without probable cause." Holt's face flushed crimson, his breath visible in the cold rain as he glanced toward Tara, who shifted uncomfortably and whispered, "She's right. Daniel, it's all on record." But Holt spun toward her, snapping. Not now. Tara! His voice was harsh, but his authority was slipping. The cameras from inside the diner catching every second, and the crowd outside was growing, bystanders from Water Street pulling out their phones, whispering as they recorded, someone muttering, "This is gonna go viral." While Sarah finally turned slightly, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "If anyone here recorded what happened inside the diner, keep those videos. Do not delete them. This is evidence." And that single sentence shifted the mood instantly, emboldening the crowd, a ripple of murmurs spreading as people realized they were witnessing something far bigger than a confrontation over breakfast. James had stepped outside now, his navy cap pulled low, his shoulders squared despite the drizzle soaking his gray hoodie, and he stopped just behind Sarah, silent but steady, his presence commanding without a word. Holt's gaze snapped to him immediately, his voice sharp and mocking. "What? You called in backup? Whitaker? Think hiding behind a badge makes you untouchable?" But James finally spoke, his voice deep and measured. "I called a friend. Daniel. Someone who remembers what loyalty looks like." And that simple sentence hung in the air heavier than the rain. Tara shifting uneasily again, her eyes darting between Holt and Sarah as if calculating her future in real time. Sarah turned slightly toward James, her tone softening briefly. "You don't have to stand out here." But James shook his head once, calm and firm. "I've stood for this country in worse storms than this." "I'm not moving," Holt scoffed, throwing up his hands. "This is ridiculous. He's homeless. He's loitering. I had every right." But Sarah cut him off instantly, her voice ringing clear through the rain. "You had no right. You had bias. Sergeant. And today, it's on full display for the world to see." The words landed like a gavel striking oak, and somewhere behind the diner windows, someone gasped audibly, the sound carrying even through the storm. By now, traffic had slowed on Water Street, drivers leaning out their windows, asking what was happening, and one teenager shouted, "It's on TikTok already! 200,000 views!" Holt's face twitched as he heard it, his anger colliding with panic for the first time. And Sarah, sensing the shift, lowered her voice, deliberate and unrelenting. "You have two options. Sergeant, step back, write your report, and let DOJ handle this, or double down and watch your badge hit the pavement by sundown." Holt stood frozen, chest heaving, his hand twitching near his belt but never touching it, and after a long, unbearable pause, he finally muttered, "Fine," before taking one small step back, though his eyes stayed locked on James, filled with resentment he could no longer hide. Tara, on the other hand, exhaled audibly, shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had just rolled off her back. And she whispered to Sarah, almost apologetically, "I tried to de-escalate inside. I knew it was wrong." And Sarah nodded curtly, her tone measured but not unkind. "Then start making it right. It's not too late." Behind them, Lila had stepped outside with Marcus, both holding mugs of untouched coffee, their faces tense but relieved as they moved closer to James. Lila's voice cracked slightly as she murmured, "You okay?" And James gave a faint smile, small and tired. "I've been worse," he said softly, and Marcus gripped his shoulder firmly, adding, "You're not alone in this, brother." And though James nodded, he said nothing, the gratitude in his eyes speaking louder than words. The confrontation seemed to settle for the moment, but Sarah wasn't done. She pulled a small tablet from her blazer pocket, tapping quickly before holding it up toward Holt and Tara, her voice cutting cleanly through the murmurs. "DOJ's ethics review team will be in Augusta within 48 hours. Until then, Sergeant, you are to stand down from any contact with Mr. Whitaker unless authorized by my office. Is that understood?" Holt clenched his jaw so tight the muscles pulsed in his neck. But he managed to force out. Understood. Though his voice carried the bitterness of a man cornered. Tara answered quickly, her voice steadier than before. "Yes, ma'am." And Sarah finally lowered the tablet, her expression softening slightly as she turned back toward James, speaking quietly so only he could hear. "You didn't deserve this. Not today. Not ever." James exhaled slowly, the rain running down his face like tears he refused to shed. And after a long pause, he said, almost under his breath, "Feels like I keep fighting the same war. Sarah, just different uniforms now." She squeezed his shoulder gently, her voice warm despite the steel beneath it. "Then we fight it together this time." Behind them, the hum of voices grew louder, notifications pinging from phones as clips of the confrontation began spreading online faster than anyone expected. And though James stood quietly, his head slightly bowed, he had no idea yet that by the end of the night, his name would be trending nationwide, his face appearing on every major news outlet, and that this rainy morning at Daisy's Diner would ignite a firestorm reaching far beyond Augusta. By noon, the storm outside Daisy's Diner had slowed to a drizzle, but the storm online was just beginning, and James Whitaker, sitting in his usual booth with a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, had no idea yet that his life was about to change forever. Lila was the first to notice, her phone buzzing non-stop on the counter until she finally glanced at the screen, her breath catching as she whispered, "Oh my God," before calling across the room, "James, it's online." And Marcus leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the glowing screen where Vance's body cam footage, somehow leaked less than an hour after the confrontation, was already climbing past 1.5 million views on TikTok alone. The comments section exploding with outrage and disbelief, hundreds of thousands of strangers demanding justice for a man they had never met. And Lila turned the screen so James could see, but he only shook his head slowly, his fingers wrapping tighter around the coffee mug as he muttered softly, "I just wanted breakfast." The footage wasn't just viral, it was everywhere at once. X, Facebook, TikTok, Reddit, news blogs, clips stitched together showing Holt's sharp words, Sarah's arrival, Lila's defense, and most of all, James's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation, and every second of it carried the kind of raw emotion that made people stop scrolling and watch to the very end. Captions flooded timelines, decorated Navy veteran harassed by Augusta police. "This is how we treat our heroes." Silver Star recipient targeted for being homeless. And the hashtag surged. Hashtag justice for James. Hashtag Augusta veteran. Hashtag stand with Whitaker. Inside Daisy's, the diner had transformed into something unrecognizable. Phones buzzing, notifications pinging, conversations overlapping as regulars sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who'd wandered in just to see the booth where the veteran sat. And Marcus, usually gruff and private, grumbled under his breath. "Feels like a circus." But even he kept glancing at the small TV mounted in the corner, where a local Wabi TV anchor reported live from outside the police station just 4 blocks away, her voice crisp as she repeated the headline. Augusta police under investigation after viral video shows alleged harassment of a decorated Navy veteran. James barely touched his oatmeal, staring blankly at the steam rising from the bowl, his mind somewhere far away, while Sarah, seated across from him, scrolled through her DOJ tablet, her expression unreadable until she looked up and said quietly, "It's spreading faster than I expected. CNN just picked it up." Lila gasped, nearly dropping her coffee pot. "CNN?" And Sarah nodded, leaning closer, lowering her voice. "James, listen to me. This isn't just Augusta anymore. This is national. Every decision from this point forward matters." But James only sighed, his voice low, almost resigned. "I never asked for any of this." "Sarah." And she reached across the table, placing her hand over his, her tone softer now. I know, but sometimes the fight finds you. Outside the diner, crowds were gathering on Water Street, drawn by live streams and the steady drip of updates from local reporters. Hand-painted signs beginning to appear in the growing crowd. I am James Whitaker. Respect our veterans. Dignity isn't optional. And the sound of chanting drifted faintly through the glass doors. Inside, the mood was mixed, a strange balance between pride and unease, with regulars comforting James one moment and glancing nervously at the cameras the next. Suddenly, a teenager burst through the door, phone in hand, excitement spilling from his voice. James, man, you're trending #2 nationwide right now, 2.7 million views on TikTok, and Twitter's at 3.4 million. But James didn't even look up, shaking his head slightly as he whispered, I'm not a hashtag kid, his voice heavy with something deeper than exhaustion, and Lila squeezed his shoulder gently, leaning close so only he could hear. Maybe not, but maybe it's time they see you. By evening, the ripple had grown into a tidal wave. NBC, ABC, and Fox all ran the story during their primetime broadcasts. Headlines blazing across banners, body cam footage, sparks, DOJ investigation, Augusta PD under fire, harassment of Silver Star veteran prompts. National outrage. And donations began flooding into a crowdfunding campaign started by a veterans advocacy group in Washington. Their initial goal of $10,000 shattered within 2 hours as the total rocketed past $120,000 by nightfall, prompting Marcus to slide a printed receipt across the table toward James, his voice quiet, almost reverent. People want to help you, man. But James pushed it gently back toward him, shaking his head. I don't need their money. Marcus and Lila, wiping her hands on her apron, chimed in softly. Maybe not, but you deserve their respect, and they're giving it to you. But with the wave of support came the inevitable backlash. Anonymous trolls filled comment sections calling James a professional victim. Others questioned his service, digging up public records, twisting fragments of his past to fit their narrative. And Sarah, seeing the effect on his face as he scrolled briefly on a borrowed phone, reached across the table, taking it from him gently. Don't look at that. James, none of them know you. None of them were there in 91. I saw you carry those men through fire. Her words steadied him, just slightly, though the weight of unwanted attention pressed harder with every passing hour. Meanwhile, Holt's world was collapsing in real time, within 12 hours. Investigative journalists had unearthed 7 prior complaints against him for racial profiling, 3 of them involving excessive force, and a local attorney announced plans to file a class-action lawsuit by week's end, while Tara Vance quietly deleted her social media accounts, the pressure of scrutiny forcing her to consider resignation even before the DOJ had finished its review. By midnight, Sarah's phone buzzed non-stop. DOJ headquarters requesting updates every 30 minutes. The Attorney General's office issuing a statement promising full transparency and accountability. And James stared at her across the table, his voice low, carrying a mix of disbelief and weariness. All this because of breakfast. And Sarah shook her head gently, correcting him. No, James. All this because they finally saw you, for the first time all day. He allowed himself a small, fleeting smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. And Marcus, leaning against the counter with arms crossed, muttered under his breath. About damn time they did. Back outside, news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, bright lights illuminating Daisy's diner like a stage, microphones extended toward anyone willing to speak, and the crowd now stretched nearly a block, chants growing louder as night fell. Justice for James! Justice for James! A reporter from NBC finally approached Sarah near the doorway. Microphone in hand, Deputy Director Coleman. Is James Whitaker safe? And Sarah nodded firmly, answering calmly but loud enough for everyone to hear. He is safe, and he is not alone. We are reviewing every second of footage, and the Department of Justice will ensure accountability. And as the statement went live on national television, phones buzzed again inside the diner with notifications announcing breaking news alerts from every major outlet. Yet through it all, James sat quietly in his booth, untouched slice of apple pie in front of him, his old navy cap folded neatly by his side, staring out the rain-streaked window at the growing crowd beyond. And though his name now echoed across millions of screens, inside he still felt like the same man who had walked 3 miles for a simple breakfast, still carrying the ghosts of battles fought decades ago, still longing for dignity more than fame. And as the chants outside grew louder, he whispered almost to himself, so soft even Lila barely caught it. I didn't want any of this. But Sarah, seated across from him, met his gaze with quiet certainty. Maybe not. James. But maybe this time. The country needed you. By Friday morning. Augusta. Maine. No longer felt like the quiet little town James Whitaker had known for years. Satellite trucks crowded Water Street. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalk outside Daisy's diner. Microphones and cameras pointed at every door and window, and chants of "Justice for James" echoed up and down the block. Yet inside, the man at the center of it all sat quietly in his corner booth, staring at a mug of cold coffee as if willing the world to go away. Lila placed a fresh pot in front of him, her voice soft but steady as she whispered, "James, you okay?" But he didn't answer right away, just rubbed a hand over his face, his rough fingers catching on the stubble of a beard he hadn't trimmed in weeks, finally murmuring, "Feels like I woke up in someone else's life." Sarah Coleman slid into the booth across from him, her DOJ badge tucked out of sight to avoid drawing more attention, her tablet buzzing every few minutes with new updates from Washington, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "James, we need to talk about what's next." He shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the steam curling up from the fresh mug. "I didn't ask for next. Sarah, I wanted breakfast. I wanted quiet. Now I can't even walk outside without people chanting my name." Sarah exhaled, her tone softening. "I know. But this isn't just about you anymore. Congress is asking questions. The Attorney General is briefing the President. Every network is covering this nonstop. You've become the face of something bigger than Augusta, bigger than Daisy's diner, bigger than any of us." James leaned back against the vinyl seat, his chest rising and falling slowly, his voice low but steady. "Bigger than me. Huh? That's funny. 'Cause it feels like everyone's talking about me without knowing a damn thing about me." Lila squeezed his shoulder gently, her voice cracking. "Then tell them. James, tell them who you are. Tell them what you've done." He shook his head again, whispering, "I'm no hero." Sarah leaned in, her eyes steady on his. "No, but you are proof. Proof of how we treat the people who've given everything and get nothing back. That's why people care. James, they're seeing you. Maybe for the first time. Outside the diner." The crowd swelled larger by the hour, chants mixing with the hum of news anchors broadcasting live, and Marcus paced behind the counter muttering curses under his breath, frustrated by the endless noise but refusing to close his doors. He needs this place. Lila. And as long as James wants his booth, this diner stays open. The bell over the door jingled softly, and a man in a sharp gray suit stepped inside, his shoes clicking softly on the linoleum as he approached James's table. Sarah tensed instinctively until the man introduced himself quietly. David Holt, Veterans Legal Alliance, Washington, D.C. "We'd like to represent you pro bono." But James waved him off gently. "I'm not suing anyone. and David hesitated before replying. James, this isn't just about you. It's about every veteran sleeping under a bridge while the country forgets their names. If you let us, we can make sure this moment matters. James didn't respond, his silence heavy enough to end the conversation, and David finally nodded, leaving a business card on the table before stepping back into the storm of cameras outside. Moments later, Sarah's tablet chimed again, another DOJ update flashing across the screen. 7 formal complaints filed against Augusta PD in the last 48 hours. 4 directly naming Holt. And she sighed, closing the cover before speaking quietly. They're panicking. James, but this is the moment to push for change. He looked up finally, his dark eyes weary but steady. Change? Feels like the only thing that changes is the names on the uniforms. Lila leaned down beside him, whispering softly. You're wrong this time. People are listening. And she was right. The numbers proved it. That morning, CNN reported 8 million combined views across TikTok and X, and by noon, hashtags linked to James's name had passed 50 million impressions. Crowdfunding campaigns organized by strangers had raised nearly $400,000 for veterans' housing initiatives, and statements poured in from national organizations demanding reform, while members of Congress tweeted their outrage, vowing investigations and promising hearings. But James avoided the TV, avoided the news apps, avoided the endless scroll of strangers' opinions. Instead, he spent most of the afternoon sitting quietly in his booth, hands wrapped around his mug, staring out at the rain-speckled street while voices around him swirled like static, reporters shouting questions he didn't answer, customers snapping photos he didn't acknowledge. Inside, his silence said more than any speech could. By late afternoon, a local veterans group arrived unannounced. A dozen men and women in worn caps and jackets standing shoulder to shoulder outside Daisy's, saluting James through the diner window when he finally noticed. His breath caught slightly, his hand trembling just enough for Lila to see, and she whispered softly, "They came for you." But he shook his head, murmuring, "They came for all of us, one by one." The veterans filed into the diner, filling the narrow aisle, and the eldest among them, a frail man in his 80s leaning on a cane, stepped forward first, his voice soft but steady. "Petty Officer Whitaker, we didn't forget what you did back then, and we won't let them forget now." James swallowed hard, unable to speak, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. And Sarah, watching quietly from the booth across, felt the weight of the moment press deeper than any headline ever could. But with visibility came pressure. By evening, the governor of Maine released a statement calling the video deeply troubling and promising full accountability, while the White House issued a rare briefing acknowledging the urgent need to address systemic bias and veterans' homelessness nationwide. National talk shows booked segments overnight. Activists organized marches in 6 states, and Daisy's Diner became an unlikely epicenter for a growing movement, though James himself still resisted the role being thrust upon him, muttering softly under his breath to Sarah, "I didn't sign up to be anyone's symbol." And Sarah, leaning forward, answered gently but firmly, "You didn't have to. You became one the moment Holt walked through that door." Later that night, after the crowd finally began thinning and the cameras shifted elsewhere, James walked the 3 blocks back to the shelter in silence, his navy cap pulled low as Sarah walked beside him, staying close but giving him space when they reached the worn steps. He stopped, staring up at the flickering porch light for a long moment before speaking softly. "Feels strange, having the world know your name, but not know you." And Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then let them hear your voice, James. Tell them what you've carried. Tell them what they need to know." He didn't answer, only nodded faintly before pushing the door open and disappearing into the dim hallway, leaving Sarah standing outside beneath the buzzing light. Her expression set, already planning what came next, because she knew this wasn't over. The hearings, the policies, the changes they'd fight for, and as she glanced back down the street at the crowd still chanting softly outside Daisy's, she realized the story had grown far beyond Augusta now. James Whitaker's quiet dignity had become a mirror, forcing the country to confront not just what happened in a diner on Water Street, but how it treated those who had given everything and been forgotten. And though James didn't want the spotlight, he couldn't escape it now. The weight of truth had found him, and the nation wasn't going to look away. By Monday morning, Augusta woke up to a different reality. The quiet capital city was now at the center of a national firestorm, and for the first time in decades, the Augusta Police Department stood under the harsh glare of federal investigation. Satellite trucks still lining Water Street, though now they had shifted their cameras toward City Hall, where Sarah Coleman held a closed-door briefing with state officials, her voice firm, deliberate, and unyielding, laying out evidence from Holt's body cam footage alongside 7 years of documented complaints against him. While across town at Daisy's Diner, James Whitaker sat in his corner booth sipping coffee, the steam curling slowly toward his face. His posture relaxed, but his eyes distant as the television above the counter carried breaking news. The anchor's voice steady but urgent. Sergeant Daniel Holt has been placed on immediate unpaid suspension pending the outcome of the DOJ investigation, while his partner, Officer Tara Vance, has officially submitted her resignation citing ethical concerns. And Marcus, polishing glasses behind the counter, muttered under his breath, "About damn time." While Lila placed a fresh plate of pie in front of James, her voice low and warm. They're finally listening. But James didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the headlines scrolling across the screen, his fingers tracing the edge of his mug as he whispered softly, almost to himself. "Feels strange seeing their names on TV instead of mine." Sarah stepped back into the diner minutes later, pulling off her blazer and sliding into the booth across from James, her expression unreadable as she set her tablet on the table. "DOJ has taken control of the case," she said simply. "Augusta PD will comply or face federal intervention." And Marcus, leaning nearby with crossed arms, let out a low whistle. "Never thought I'd see the day." But Sarah barely looked up, scrolling through her notifications as she added, "The department's Internal Affairs Division is collapsing under scrutiny. They've already uncovered 8 additional profiling incidents tied to Holt, 2 of them involving minors. And now the State Attorney General is opening a broader review of police conduct across Maine." Lila set down a tray of coffee for the table, shaking her head slowly. So much damage from one man. But Sarah corrected her gently, her voice steady but weighted. "Not just one man. Lila, this goes deeper than Holt. He was the spark, not the fire." Outside the diner, small groups of protesters gathered in the drizzle, holding signs and chanting softly, "Justice for James," while across the street, a handful of counter-protesters waved banners reading, "Back the badge," though their voices were drowned out by the growing crowd of supporters. James noticed none of it, his attention fixed on the small, cracked screen of the borrowed tablet Sarah had handed him, scrolling slowly through an article showing veterans across the country marching in solidarity, holding signs with his name, his face, his story, and his jaw tightened slightly as he whispered, "They're making me into something I'm not." And Sarah reached across the table, her tone softening. "You're not a symbol by choice, James. You're a reminder. And right now, the country needs reminding." He sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Feels heavy." And Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand briefly. "It is heavy, but you're not carrying it alone anymore." Later that afternoon, Augusta's mayor held a press conference flanked by the city council, promising sweeping reforms including mandatory bias training, body cam audits, and the establishment of an independent civilian review board, her voice shaky under the weight of the national spotlight. What happened to Mr. Whitaker was unacceptable, and Augusta must take responsibility, while just blocks away, inside police headquarters. Holt sat stone-faced during a disciplinary hearing, refusing to answer questions without his union representative present. His once commanding presence reduced to silence as the DOJ's investigative team projected clips from his own body cam onto a screen for the panel. Every sneer, every taunt, every aggressive gesture laid bare before the world. Tara Vance, meanwhile, had quietly cleared out her locker earlier that morning, her resignation letter handwritten and brief. I failed to uphold my oath. I will not fail again. And Sarah, reading the statement aloud to James over lunch, glanced up to find him nodding slightly, his voice low but steady. She made her choice. Maybe she finds peace now. By evening. The DOJ released a preliminary report citing significant evidence of systemic misconduct within Augusta PD, and the Attorney General announced plans for a statewide review of law enforcement practices, prompting news anchors across the country to declare, "This case may set a national precedent for handling racial bias and veteran protections." But while the rest of the nation debated policies and procedures, James still wrestled with quieter battles at the shelter that night, sitting alone on the edge of his cot. He stared down at the VA housing voucher Sarah had placed in his hand earlier, the printed words feeling heavier than paper. "You earned this," she had told him, but he couldn't shake the thought. Did I earn it? Or did the cameras? Outside the shelter, a small group of local high school students had taped handwritten notes to the door. Messages like, "Thank you for your service and you're not invisible anymore." And when James found them the next morning, he folded one carefully and slid it into his wallet, saying nothing but carrying it with him everywhere, inside Daisy's. Marcus installed a small brass plaque above James's booth without telling him, engraved with 5 simple words, "Reserved for our hero James." And when James noticed it, he stared at it for a long moment before finally murmuring, "I'm no hero." But Marcus, wiping down the counter nearby, called back without looking up, "You don't get to decide that, brother." Meanwhile, Sarah spent most of her nights on conference calls with Washington, coordinating next steps while fielding calls from national advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and lawmakers eager to leverage James's story for broader reforms. And when she returned to the diner late Tuesday night, exhausted but energized, she slid into the booth beside James and whispered, "We're getting calls from Chicago, Dallas, Oakland. People are asking how they can help." And James gave a faint smile, replying softly, "Maybe they start by seeing us." And Sarah nodded, her voice firm but warm. "Exactly. Seeing you, James, means seeing every veteran who's been overlooked. That's the change you're making, across the country." Other stories began surfacing as well, veterans sharing their experiences of harassment, discrimination, and homelessness under the trending tag hashtag #IamJamesWhitaker. The hashtag growing from a local rallying cry into a national movement within 72 hours, amplified by prominent voices from politics, sports, and Hollywood alike. Though James himself remained largely disconnected from it all, refusing interviews, declining appearances, insisting quietly to Sarah, "I'm not built for cameras. I just want my life back." And Sarah respected that, shielding him where she could. But even she knew there was no going back. The world had seen him now, and through him, the world had seen itself. By week's end, Augusta PD had suspended 3 additional officers linked to prior profiling complaints. The City Council voted unanimously to approve funding for expanded housing programs for veterans, and the DOJ announced plans to host a national summit on bias and policing reform, inviting James to attend as a guest of honor, when Sarah told him. He hesitated, staring at the floor for a long moment before replying softly. If it means fewer kids end up where I am, then yeah, I'll go. His voice quiet but certain, carrying the weight of a man who never asked to lead but refused to stand aside when the moment demanded it. That night, as he left Daisy's and walked slowly back toward the shelter under a sky just beginning to clear after days of rain, James paused halfway down Water Street, turning to look back at the neon sign glowing faintly in the dark. His reflection blurred in the puddles at his feet, and for the first time since the confrontation, he let himself breathe deeply, the cold air filling his lungs as he whispered softly to no one in particular. Maybe we're finally being seen. Tuesday morning arrived with skies finally clear over Augusta, the streets washed clean by days of rain, but inside Daisy's diner, the air carried a quiet anticipation as cameras lined the back walls. Reporters waited outside, and locals filled every seat, leaving only one booth untouched, James Whitaker's. He stood at the front of the diner now, his old Navy cap resting in his hand, his posture straight but humble, his deep voice steady as he looked around at faces both familiar and new. I'm not a hero, he began softly, pausing long enough for his words to settle. I'm just a man who served, who fought, who lost more than you'll ever know. And all I wanted last Wednesday was a hot cup of coffee and a little peace. The diner stayed silent, every person leaning forward, the weight of his presence drawing them in as he continued, his tone carrying both strength and weariness. I wore this uniform for 20 years, through storms, through fire, through nights I thought I'd never see morning, and I buried brothers who never made it home. Men who gave everything they had to a country that promised to remember them. But too often, it doesn't. His voice caught briefly before he steadied it again, glancing down at the cap in his hand. You didn't see those men. You didn't see the deck burning beneath our feet, the screams, the smoke, the choices we had to make in seconds. But I did, and I carry them with me every day. Sarah sat near the counter, her expression soft but fierce, nodding quietly as James raised his gaze, his voice growing stronger now. I came home believing we'd earned something, respect, dignity, a place at the table. But instead, too many of us came home to silence, to shadows, to being unseen until a body cam catches us being harassed over breakfast. A murmur swept through the diner, emotions stirring. But James held up a hand gently, his tone calming again. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because this isn't just about me. There are thousands like me, veterans sleeping in shelters, working odd jobs, walking into diners just hoping for a little humanity. And they deserve better. We all do, outside. A growing crowd stood quietly now, listening through open windows as James's voice carried beyond the walls, and news cameras from across the street caught every word, broadcasting live to millions nationwide. Lila stood near the coffee machine, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron while Marcus leaned against the counter, his arms folded tight across his chest, pride and anger mixing in his expression as James went on, his tone low but commanding. Respect isn't charity. It isn't pity. It isn't a gift you hand out when you feel like it. Respect is a debt, a promise, and we've broken that promise too many times. He paused, letting the silence linger, and for a moment, the only sound in the diner was the faint hum of the neon sign buzzing overhead. Sarah finally stepped forward, standing slightly behind him in quiet solidarity, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. James took a slow breath, his voice softening as he added, "What happened here started with one man's choices, but what happens next? That's on all of us. How we treat the unseen, how we see each other, how we stand when standing feels hardest. That's who we are. The room stayed still, every face fixed on him, some nodding, some wiping tears. And James glanced briefly toward the small brass plaque Marcus had hung above his booth. Reserved for our hero James, his lips pressing into a faint, almost shy smile before he continued. I don't need my name on a booth. I need it on a promise that no one who served this country, no one who gave their life to it, will ever be treated like they're disposable. A wave of soft applause began, building slowly until it filled the diner, spilling into the street outside where chants of justice for James broke out again, louder this time. But James raised his hand gently, quieting them as he finished, his voice deep and steady. Don't make this about me. Make it about everyone who deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with the dignity they've earned. If this moment means anything, let it mean we stop looking away for a long heartbeat. There was silence again, the kind that carries weight, meaning, and collective understanding. Before the room erupted in applause, some standing, others crying openly, while outside. The crowd picked up his words, chanting seen, heard, respected until the sound echoed down Water Street. Moments later, Sarah stepped up beside him, announcing quietly but firmly. The Department of Justice has completed its review. Starting today, Augusta PD will undergo full federal oversight. Holt's suspension will move toward permanent termination, and new state legislation will introduce veteran protection protocols nationwide. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters shouted questions, but James stepped back, retreating to his booth as Sarah took over, determined to shield him from the chaos he never asked for, while Lila placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, whispering softly, "For what it's worth, we see you now." And James smiled faintly, replying just loud enough for her to hear, "I just hope they see the others too." In the weeks that followed, change came fast. Augusta became the pilot city for a federal Dignity First initiative protecting homeless veterans from unlawful profiling. Daisy's Diner transformed into a symbol of resilience and justice, and donations from across the country funded a new community center named in honor of 6 sailors James had saved in 1991, not for him, but for the brothers he never stopped carrying. And as the cameras faded and the crowds dispersed, James finally moved into a small apartment overlooking the Kennebec River, a quiet place where he could breathe, sip his coffee, and plan the next chapter on his terms. He wasn't seeking fame, and he didn't need it. He had something better now, a seat at the table, a voice that mattered, and a country finally learning to listen. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. See you in the next story.